Thanks, Andy. I'd just like to address a couple of the questions that have come in that are not particularly relevant to this session. So I don't think we're going to discuss them, but I want to make sure that they're stated because we should cover them in another session. One is the concerns, and I'm sure we've all heard that, about respirators being used as transmission devices. That's really the discussion on face coverings, how they affect transmission, and in particular, the exhalation valve and the need to have some understanding. And we heard a little bit of it yesterday. Mark Nichols talked about it, I think, without so much the data, but talked about, where aerosols may be coming out of a respirator worn by somebody if that person happens to have a virus. Another one was that came in, which I think may work better for the next session, is should there be an organization like NIOSH, but maybe different, for the public use of respirators that handles conformity assessment? And that's really not appropriate for this session, but it could be very well for the next one. And another one that I don't think has to do with contingent workers is the privatization of NIOSH's conformity assessment. I think they mean the testing of devices, whether they could be done in private laboratories. And I think that's probably for another time. At this point, while I have a couple of thoughts, I would rather, one last thing, somebody did mention about the issue of counterfeit respirators that claim to be NIOSH certified that are not. And Maryann, I think, addressed that yesterday, so they can go back and see that. I'd like to, I have some thoughts, but I'd like to open it up to the speakers to talk specifically about this contingent workforce issues, workforces that, and Andy, I think, has addressed OSHA's view of those contingent ones. And Bill Cajola has talked about that yesterday in discussions, but I'd like to bring it up to the speakers as to how does this impact conformity assessment and standards, having groups of people that are not meeting the standard respirator programs that we anticipate or expect with conformity assessment?
This is Maryann. I can start with that. So I think it goes back to the framework where we have to look at if they're not meeting those requirements, then what are requirements that they are able to meet. So of course, we always want to bring the science to the standards and have science behind our recommendations. But you also have to look at it from the practicality standpoint. So how do you balance the science and the practicality and the policy of all of these issues? And I think that's something that we need to take a really close look at. And, what are the hazards that we're trying to address here? And are there existing standards that could address those hazards? Or could those standards be modified in some way to address the hazards? And what type of PPE then could be used based on that? So I think it's all looking at the framework is the way I think we should consider our path forward, because that gives you a process to look at what the needs are and how we address them.
So Howard, this is Jeff Stull. I have something to add on to that, and I fully agree that framework is really important. And I'll give you a current example that we're facing right now. I'm on a work group that is trying to find harmonization in how we position what we're now calling barrier face coverings. And just getting to that term alone. And what we're talking about are cloth face coverings, what a lot of people just call plain masks. For a variety of people, this could be for workers, this could be for the general population, and so on. So it could encompass just about everyone in the United States at one point or another, and probably does. So how we write those standards, and trying to find out what the hazards really are, and how we set requirements, and making sure that we're not writing such a lofty standard that we basically write out every product in the marketplace. Because you can, as you've seen all the different products emerge in the commercials and at stores and everyone that's now in this business of making masks thinks they have the greatest thing. And we have to have requirements that are well-grounded in terms of not only the science that Maryann mentions, but further that are pragmatic and practical for reaching all these groups. And it's been a difficult struggle. I can tell you that we're getting there, and we hope to have a standard in short order, but trying to decide what the fundamental requirements are for those groups under a variety of different circumstances where those products will be used has been a tremendous challenge. But it comes back to the framework and defining what those hazards are, what kinds of products are we applying it to, how we can write appropriate requirements, and then how do those manufacturers that offer products can actually demonstrate appropriately to the buyers that the products are appropriate. And on top of that, things like user instructions, limitations of products, that things or what kinds of claims can even be made with respect to those products.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff. Other thoughts from our participants? One that I keep thinking about is if we have contingent groups that struggle to meet a respiratory protection program as defined by OSHA. And one of the ones I always hear about, and everyone else probably does too, is fit testing. You know, they can do, particularly if they're using a filtering face piece respirator, they don't have to worry about cleaning, disinfecting under normal times anyways. They don't have to worry about all those things, but how do they fit test? And it seems to me that you could have a standard that developed that for a respirator that did not require fit testing, but required a really good user seal check. And it seems to me that this would be a complicated issue because, first of all, OSHA requires fit testing of a tight-fitting respirator. So you would have to coordinate that among a certifying group, presumably NIOSH. And you would also have to find then a respirator manufacturer that has the vision for that, to do that. So I keep thinking about that. And the other thing I've thought, I was impressed with yesterday on the wildland, NFPA wildland firefighting, and I understand there's a standard and nobody makes a respirator for it. But the other issue is, my goodness, it must be so difficult for somebody to go out into a fire, into the woods, into the forest with a fire. They're going to be growing beard. There's no place to shave. What are the respirators? What type of respirators are available? So you almost need, and I've always been incredibly impressed with NPPTL, how much work they do for how much money they get and have to work with, and the size of their staff. But you almost need a group that would say, how do we develop that respirator that helps them out? Because obviously manufacturers struggle with that. And so these to me are some of the contingent workforces. How do you develop devices? How do you develop the standards for those things? And I don't think they necessarily build off of existing products. But I do agree with Jeff and Maryann that you have to follow a scheme if you want to have any confidence in the device.
So, Howard, this is Andy. I think I would not let the OSHA fit test requirement be an impediment. The no fit test tight fitting respirator is a bit like the Loch Ness Monster or the Yeti, right? It's a mythical creature that we're pretty sure might exist somewhere in the wild, right? And
yes,
the reason that OSHA has a fit test requirement for tight fitting respirators is because right now the evidence suggests that the fit test is necessary in order to assure that the respirator fits properly and the worker gets the expected level of protection. If there was some alternate standard for a no fit test tight fitting respirator where there was widespread confidence that workers would get effective fits, I think OSHA would certainly be open to reconsidering or adding that as a new class of device that could be exempted. It's just we haven't seen the evidence yet that such a product exists and that there's sufficient data to support, that you could do away with the fit test. But the OSHA standards are always modifiable if the evidence suggests that they should be.
Well, we did hear a little bit yesterday, and I've experienced this, that from somebody that depending on the respirator model, some models actually do very well with the user seal check in predicting how the fit test would be. But that's a combination of a NIOSH research project as well as manufacturers. But I think it's better than the Loch Ness Monster. I've got a little more confidence in it, but not much. You're pretty close to it, Andy.
So Howard, this is Jeff Stull. I actually think we're trying a hybrid approach with this barrier face mask. We're actually putting in a fit test, although we're not calling it a fit test. We're calling it a leakage test. And we're putting that responsibility on the manufacturer. So they have a panel, not the full panel that normally NIOSH uses, but a small panel. So the hope is that while maybe the end users won't be doing a fit test, that they'll have a panel where they demonstrate relative fit of a product. Now, mind you, that these are products that may have very close to 1 protection factors. And we think by just putting the standard in, putting this test method in, and having manufacturers start to do this, they start to learn what fit is. And they start to learn how to build products for better fit. And we may or may not set a lower limit, say something 1.5 or 3.0 for a fit factor or protection factor. But it's going to start moving things in that direction for, we know, a population that isn't going to be doing fit testing.
That's great. That's great. That's very innovative. The other thing I thought about in coming here is that we have NIOSH, obviously, and I'm really thinking of air purifying respirators, has inhalation exhalation resistance requirements so that a healthy person can use that respirator and be confident that they can breathe through that respirator. So in this contingent workforce, I think Andy has probably addressed this, but do we always have medical testing and medical clearance for some of these workers? And therefore, do we have confidence that those workers can actually use the respirators, whereas the NIOSH test criteria is really based on a healthy worker? And Maryann can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're right, because when we do the evaluations, we have to have particular criteria for those workers, and they're generally healthy workers.
Bill, did you want to add?
I have a comment to make, and sort of a warning to the committee when it writes the report, that I think we're introducing some confusion in our definitions. Yesterday, we talked about non-traditional workers, and those were workers, as defined by this committee, workers who perform duties outside of a formal respiratory protection program, right? And that's what I talked about yesterday in certain industries, some in more detail. Andy has been talking about, in the discussion now, is about non-traditional employment, and they're not the same. We're not talking necessarily about non-traditional employment, temporary workers, contingent workers, versus the kinds of situations where these non-traditional workers that I was talking about are generally full-time employees working in an industry where there may not be a formal respiratory protection program, but there needs to be because there's exposure risk. So make sure you don't equate the two.
That's a great point, Bill. Thank you. That's a great point. That we are in the non-traditional employment with speaking about employees who are using respiratory protection but without an entirely complete respirator program. So that's a good point. It doesn't matter what they're doing; they're using respirators. And you brought up yesterday in a non-voluntary basis, where an employer has given it to them to say, here's a respirator, or you need to wear a respirator to perform this task, and they don't have a full respirator program.
Right. They don't. In fact, they may not have anything other than handing out respirators to workers and say, here it is, and this will protect you, and there's nothing else. The emperor has no clothes. Right.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Howard.
We've still got plenty of time. If anyone else, let me see what we've generated in. No, I don't want to deal with public. I'm just looking at our questions. And one that's relevant to this are N95 manufacturing sites inspected as part of NPPTL's process, but you've already answered that, Maryann, excuse me. And the answer is, I think yes, but so Sundaresan Jarman has asked the question, do agencies have a fast track route for development, approval, and publishing standards when public health emergencies such as COVID-19 arise? And if so, what's the typical time frame for developing a standard? That's a good question.
So I'll touch on that, and then if Jeff Peterson wants to jump in, he can. A good example is the powered air purifying respirator standard that was published during the COVID response. While we had been working on it for years, we had another year or so to go before it was going to be published, but we were able to get the team to finalize everything very quickly within a month and get it as an interim final rule within several weeks after that. So during times like this, it is possible that rules can be expedited. And we have, yes. So that's what's going on now.
So, yeah, I think, I echo what Maryann says. This is Jeff Peterson. So, we were successful in getting the PAPR rule out. And I think with the vast knowledge that we're gaining in this response effort, we do have other activities that could be pursued, under this if we could come up with the resources to deal with that. So I think that's one of the challenges as an agency that we have is, maintaining the throughput that we need to address that equipment is making its way to the field in these arenas. But, in this effort, it's also been challenging to maintain and keep up with what needs to be done or corrected to maintain, continuity and still get new standards out there as required. So, in addition to that, I think, we are also are, as Jeff Stull said, continuing to take those things that we're hearing and those needs to some of the consensus standards agencies. So I think that those are also right now successful endeavors. So, Jeff, I don't know if there's anything else.
So I'll speak to that, Howard, as well on the alternative conformity assessment process, essentially the ASTM and NFPA standards. ASTM has somewhat of a fast track. So in reality, if you had a first ballot of a standard and it came out perfectly, you'd be done in a couple of weeks, or months. But because it's a consensus process and because there are rules to make sure that it's fair and balanced, obviously you have to be really, really good to be able to get a standard through quickly. And there's some trade-offs that have to be made, but the processes themselves are pretty wide open in terms of as long as the rules for consensus are followed and the balance is maintained by the participation, then standards can be put out relatively quickly. And I say quickly, we're really talking 3 months at the very shortest, 6 months for still really fast, and usually a lot longer for that. Some other standards organizations, for example, NFPA has a much longer process, and organizations like IACA can actually react very quickly with standards as well, but they have to go through their own consensus process.
Yeah, and for OSHA, we typically deal with these issues through enforcement flexibilities or interpretations. We also have the ability under the general duty clause to impose some requirements, and then a very rarely used but still possible mechanism is an emergency temporary standard. But again, those are exceedingly rarely used. It's been probably a couple of decades since the last one that the agency did.
We've had a comment from one of our attendees. I don't know that it needs a response, but it points out that nursing homes and dentist offices are places where they think the participant says we don't have traditional respiratory protection programs, but they use respirators. Clearly, the dentist office uses respiratory protective devices. I'm not sure the nursing home always does, but under COVID, they certainly have. I don't know if you have any. Bill had mentioned yesterday both schools as well as meatpacking plants as two examples of what one would say is traditional workplaces using respirators without respirator programs. If I haven't botched it up, Bill, and added these two to it. Maybe you want to address that, Andy.
Yeah. So in general, if there is a hazard that the employees are being protected from, they have to have a respiratory protection program. So the fact that people may not be complying with the standard does not mean that they don't have to comply with the standard, and that if OSHA walked in and responded to a complaint, for example, that we wouldn't cite those employers for not having a traditional respiratory protection standard. I think what you will find in a lot of these other settings, though, is OSHA has under its respiratory protection standard something called the voluntary use provision, where the employer has not formally determined that respirators are necessary, but nonetheless allows employees to use them for essentially comfort reasons. And sometimes that is appropriate, and sometimes that might be abused. And that's the sort of thing that, again, OSHA would look at as we walked into a work setting to respond to a complaint and determine whether, in fact, there was something that was necessary or that necessitated the use of a respirator, or if it truly was voluntary use. When OSHA added that provision, the intention was, for example, somebody's cleaning out a break room or a storeroom, and they're sweeping up and there's some incidental dust, and they put on a respirator just for comfort, but it's not a level of dust that would rise to the level that required a true respirator. So that's how we look at those issues.
We've had a question. I think this is. Let me get that question again from Maryann, which is somebody's asking when during certification, when respirators are tested by a fit test panel, are those results available for others to see how well certain models have done versus others? And it's my understanding, and Maryann or Jeff Peterson can correct me, those don't happen at the present time for filtering facepiece respirators, but they happen for under the standards and certification and approval for other respirators.
Oh, Howard, this is Jeff. So you're absolutely right. There is no requirement within 42 CFR for particulate-only type devices. So a fit test is not done as part of the approval. For other types of respirators, there are requirements for fit, but it's different. They're not requirements for individual fit as much as they are to show collective fit amongst the identified population. For instance, what we're doing is we're taking the NIOSH panel and making sure that fit can be achieved across those populations by the number of sizes or models that are offered under an approval. So it is a bit different. It's not fit in the sense of individual fit. It's fit to say that the product does in fact meet some criteria for a population. So no, you're absolutely right. We don't share the test data as it's considered, in accordance with the regulation, to be somewhat of a proprietary piece of information. In fact, they are minimum requirements. So
I'm going to ask
Howard.
Yes.
This is Mark Nichols.
Yeah.
To this point, I think that this should not be proprietary information if the fit results are generated by NIOSH testing. And I think that the results of a fit panel testing for different respirators would be very good in terms of a program manufacturer or program administrator being able to assess the capability of fit of different respirators to their particular workforce so that they don't waste a lot of time in fit testing with respirators that aren't going to fit their workforce. And I think it would be good for the general public. I realize this is not a panel on the general public, but I think that's information the general public would like to use. And I know that respirator manufacturers are loath to have these results released to the general public because they don't want to be at competitive disadvantage versus other manufacturers. That's too bad. I think that if government testing of these products is going forward, that's public information and it shouldn't be held as proprietary by NIOSH.
Well, there's a long and tortured history here about NIOSH has attempted, to its credit, to establish some minimum requirements for fit for filtering face-piece respirators. And this is something when I was at the AFL-CIO that we supported. There's a long history here, but it never ended up sticking on the wall. So there's no fit requirements for filtering face-piece respirators in terms of the approval process, which is, I think, unfortunate because it's
just about ready for a break, but Maryann, did you want to add something? I saw you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say that relative to that, we are working on an ASTM standard for the respirator fit capability, and that is a standard that could lead to some level of fit capability being assessed. Whether or not the manufacturers could just report that as part of their product certification, or whether that is something that gets incorporated by reference in 42 CFR Part 84. Those are the things that we are discussing right now. So that standard's been under development for several years now.
Oh, okay, so I've cut into everyone's lunch break, and I apologize. We go for lunch, and those on the West Coast, it's about time you have breakfast, and we'll reconvene at 12:15. So 30 minutes, actually about 27 minutes for a break. So thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers and participants.